Welcome to this discussion with Koen de Temmerman and Evert van Emde Boas on cognition and ancient characterization. Koen is professor of classics at Ghent University in Belgium, and Evert is professor in classical philology at Aarhus University in Denmark. We're going to be talking about their book, Cognition and Ancient Characterization, which was published by Brill in 2018. How does your volume on characters and characterization fit into the series as a whole?
Thank you so much for having us, Elizabeth. It's I love the project, so it's great to be part of it and talk about it. So it's this book, which, as you say, is volume 4 in a series. So the title is Characterization in Ancient Greek Literature, and the titles they're all quite similar. So it starts, volume 1 is narrators and narratives and narratives in ancient Greek literature, and then we have a volume on time in ancient Greek literature, and one on space, and most recently one on speech. The series was conceptualized and started by Irene de Jong, and it was meant as a narratological literary history of all of Greek literature. So it approaches the whole range of texts in Greek literature, from Homer to, well, in our volume, the 3rd or 4th century AD, from a variety of narratological angles.
So can you say a little bit about how you conceive of narrative, or how narrative is conceived of broadly in the series, and how that affects what you have done?
Yeah, there's actually a bit of an interesting evolution in the series as it progressed. So I think it's fair to say that Irene in volume 1, she had a quite strict definition of what counts as narrative, but because so many Greek genres have embedded narratives, so stories told within other genres. So in oratory, you have the narrative portion where the accuser or the defendant will go through the facts as they happened, and that's a bit of narrative within the larger speech. Or within drama, you have messengers that come on stage and relate a story about what happened off stage. So those were the portions of works within those diverse genres that especially the earlier volumes in the series would focus on. In the 3rd volume, there was already a little bit of an evolution away from that sort of very narrow conception of what to focus on, and we felt that it was important in ours to perhaps to stretch the boundaries even wider, because character doesn't fit neatly into that box of that window of what counts as narrative and what doesn't count as narrative in one of those works. If you take drama, which I work on particularly, characters are characterized in the narrative portions, but also outside of the narrative portions. And it's interesting to contrast and compare how that happens inside and outside narrative, but you also can't leave everything else out in order to get to a full view of the different techniques and aspects of character that come to the fore in these works. So that's why we felt it was important to have a relatively broad definition of what our contributors could analyze.
Koen, I know you're an expert on characterization in ancient novels. How did this project maybe affect the way you address characterization?
Yeah, so the focus in the volume, so our conceptualization of narrative was kind of designed to accommodate all these different genres which contain more or less narrative. Novels will be narrative from beginning to end, but as Evert noted, this is very different in some of the other genres. Specificity with novels is, of course, that characters they're being typically designed from scratch, right? Which is not the case in tragedy, where of course audience of ancient tragedy would have had an image of all these characters in their mind, because these characters are part of the culture and different cultural registers. In novels, these characters don't exist before the novel is written, so there are different processes at work, and our idea was to have a look at the different techniques used by narrators, by vocalizers, so from narratological point of view, and see how these things proceed. So in a sense, this book in its totality makes a case for close reading, I would say. it's and in that sense, it also fits very well, I think, within the series as a whole. So the name of the series as a whole is Studies in Ancient Greek Narrative, and is so it's the dedicated narratological focus that keeps all the volumes together.
I want to pick up on what you said, Koen, about the in focalization, this creation of a character from scratch in the novelistic work. And then in other types of genres, you might have characters that are known quantities. And so how does your understanding of what cognition or a cognitive approach to characters can help us do?
In the introduction of volume, we try to make a distinction between, let's say, two sides of how characters are being constructed. So on the one hand, and that's perhaps the most important part of the volume, we have the construction of characters by narrators, so to say. So which techniques do these narrators use to construct speech, actions, direct characterization, etc., the appearance of characters. But then, of course, there's also the side of the reader, and there it's about the mental activity of readers, by which they, on the basis of all these cues that they're and on the basis of all the information that they are given in the narrative, how they start to build up character throughout their reading. And that's, of course, that side of things there, of course, cognitive studies are important. If we assume that some of the essential cognitive principles underlying our brain processes are not fundamentally different for us than for an ancient audience. So cognitive studies allows some sense of or allows us to formulate some sense of more or less universal premises on which logical thinking and the processing of information to create coherent packages of information might work.
Because readers or audiences will bring in information they already know from either prior texts or prior experience, and it seems like the narratological devices or the characterization techniques that a writer would use, say, to portray Socrates in a certain way, might challenge an audience more than a character that's created. Would you say that that's the case?
I think you're right, and especially if writers want to portray characters that are known and they want to depict them in ways which are which kind of deviate from how they are known in the tradition, then it becomes, of course, a particularly challenging task, and then places in the story like the introduction of the character might become very meaningful or very important for them. In the book, we used a fairly rough division from cognitive studies between top-down characterization and bottom-up characterization, where in one case you have narrators attributing a certain quality to a character and then letting that take its course throughout the narrative. In other cases, you have characters being built up much more gradually through different indications throughout the narrative, so that readers in the course of their reading kind of compile their own image. And these principles might vary, or the use of these principles might vary in function of what an author really wants to do and how much they deviate from what is known about these characters in a specific culture.
To a certain extent, all that goes for brand new characters too. The brand new character who's introduced as a pirate in the novel, or the young girl that will do all kinds of top-down activation of frames and schemata that ancient readers will have had about that particular type of character. Although then it's still very important to see what the bottom-up information adds to the complete package. And I guess it's fair to say that with a character like an Achilles or an Odysseus from myth, a lot of the a lot of the top-down information is built in, as it were. Although, as Koen said, authors do all kinds of interesting stuff to try to nudge the view of a character slightly away from perhaps a more traditional version in this.
So you define characters in your book as, and I quote, the relatively stable, moral, mental, social, and personal traits which pertain to an individual. That's the end of quote. How do you see that developing traditional narratological understandings of character?
We spent a lot of time in conceptualizing our introduction to the volume of pinning down those definitions. Is it enough to count as character if a character just does something, or does it have to point to something more permanent, more stable? It seems that a lot of notions of what character is involve that sense that you're getting at some permanent trait of the person, of the individual. There are all kinds of other questions about, I guess, the ontology of character that are relevant here too. Is a character just an assemblage of traits, as it were, or is it also the things that they do, the things that they say, what goes into under the header, as it were? And I think we tried with that part of our definition at least to find something that captured a fairly broad range of I don't know what the definition was, but moral and ethical and psychological traits of a person, physical too, including those in character, because physical traits were important in antiquity. But steering it towards that sense of that somehow had to be, a permanent aspect, a permanent trait of the character in order to qualify under that label. How's
the cognitive approach to narratology, to characterization and characters fit into your definition?
I think one of the things to take into account here is that an additional complexity we were facing, and which we try to navigate in our introduction, is that the very concept of character itself is, of course, cultural dependent in certain ways. I mean, some scholars of ancient Greek literature suggest that it's perhaps better to talk about mind reading of characters, because the label itself of character kind of activates in our minds notions of permanency and perhaps other notions which cannot be straightforwardly retrojected into a classical past. So we try to, in the introduction, discuss these reservations. In the end, we did decide to keep the notion of character and of characterization. Consequently, cognitive studies do provide some sort of premises which can be thought to be universal, even if these characters were written in societies very different from ours, both in time and space, and in a culturally very, very different worlds. The idea that when we read a novel or a piece of historiography, or we read or listen to epic, the idea that characters will take shape throughout our reading, and that we will accommodate differences. We will try to accommodate contradictory information given by different narrators, for example, in the work. We will process this information and try to establish some sort of hierarchy of pieces of information given. That's perhaps some sort of more universal and less culturally dependent.
It's so helpful that you say that, because I think about applying it to how we can see what characters do, I guess. So is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, we also tried in the book we invited our contributors to pay specific attention exactly to how characters themselves are presented as thinking or as speculating about things which they don't know, or speculating about other characters, or how precisely the emotions of characters are being depicted in response to things that happen in the narrative, which might then mirror or not the responses by readers.
We've talked about how you define characters. I want to pick up then on how you define characterization, and it's very. It seems like it's very reader-centered rather than than writer-centered. So you define characterization as, and this is a quote, the ways in which traits of all kinds are ascribed to a character in a text. And then you also say it's the interpretive process by which readers of a text form an idea of that character. So it seems like in your idea of characterization, you're getting away from this idea that the formation of a character is simply something that a writer does, or simply something that's that exists in the text. And instead, you're defining it in a very reader-centered way that is something that is part of the interpretive process. Where, so can you say more about that?
And I think that's exactly where, for us in the volume at least, cognitive approaches were most relevant. I argue that the volume is fairly light touch in how much cognitive approach it brings in, but that last aspect of the definition you quoted is precisely where it became relevant to us, and also where it seemed to us that the study of characterization within literary theory, broadly speaking, had, by the point that we were sort of thinking through this and writing our introduction, had progressed to a stage where the reader couldn't be left out anymore at all. So even before cognitive approaches came in, the work of Uri Margolin is important here. Reader response theory, the reader couldn't be left out of definitions of what characterization was for us anymore. And that's why the cognitive model had a sort of a way into our introduction as well. And yeah, I think it's important to think of and conceive of characterization as something that's, together with text and together with what writers give us, is done in the head of the reader. We form an image of a character, and we take these clues that we're given and shape them together to get an idea of what a person in a novel or in a play is like.
I was just wanted to add that at the same time, volume as such has a fairly strong and fairly dedicated focus to precisely these textual techniques of characterization, which makes it fit in the broader narratological approach. So it's really a combination of both. So we have an analysis of which techniques of characterization are being used on the one hand, and it's only once you have looked through these and you've examined these that you can then proceed to what do readers do with this, and what happens in the mind, in our minds when we see all this happen in a story.
I think theoretically and methodologically, it was also a bit of us having our cake and eating it too, in that we allowed for much more traditional literary theoretical approaches to character that see it as something that happens in a text that an author does, but also brought in these slightly newer ways of looking at how characterization works that is more reader focused. In being part of this series, almost inevitably the focus had to be on textual things, on things that happen in the text. But yeah, it's we allowed ourselves to find a sort of a middle ground between those two ways of looking at where characterization happens.
So in that sense, we really see the book as yeah, let's say a combination of the more traditional classical literary theory and narratology, as we've seen it develop towards the end of the 20th century, and cognitive approaches. So for us, it's really a combination of both, and the other can't really work, or in the volume at least, the one can't really work without the other.
Are there any essays that you see as developing the interest in cognitive science that you put out in your introduction?
Yeah, there are a few. So for instance, Michael Lloyd, in his chapter on Sophocles, takes the notion of schemata, of top-down information that you're provided from myth, from the real world and really runs with that notion and sort of organizes his chapter around it. John Morgan in the last chapter on Heliodorus also works with that notion of bottom-up processing and top-down processing, the sort of the main cognitive instrument that we gave people to work with in a really sophisticated way, with a really nice close reading of the latter books of the Ethiopica. I think other parts of what we offer in the introduction, and again, it's a fairly light touch way of introducing some cognitive theory, got taken up much less. Notions of mind reading, for instance, didn't get used by our contributors much. The one topic that people really ran with and sort of took on as a useful thing is this notion of primacy, the notion that when you're confronted with information up front, that will determine how you read a character strongly later on. So this notion that it's a dynamic process, but that what happens early on is important, that is something that we see in a lot of the chapters in the volume.
You talk about the sorts of narratological devices and characterization techniques that appear throughout ancient Greek literary history. What do you think are the most important? What do you see showing up over and over and over again?
It's of course a question we asked ourselves when we were writing the epilogue. Some techniques are certainly more pervasively present than others, but that probably says more about narrative in general than about Greek literary history. I mean, if you have characterization, characters do things, characters say things, and then readers will evaluate how relevant these things are, and what these things done and said will mean for long-term or for depictions of these characters more generally, and whether these deeds or actions are rather limited to a moment or have broader implications for their characterization. It was difficult, I think, to kind of map these different techniques. I think we say 1 or 2 sentences about this in the epilogue as well, to map specific techniques or the prominence of specific techniques to specific genres. It's much fuzzier than that. Techniques which are being heavily discussed in ancient rhetorical theory, that these are of course very prominent, and that has of course to do with the whole cultural context, the educational context in which much of this was written. Some of these techniques of characterization were really part and parcel of the editorial toolkit that was being taught in the schools, in the progymnasmata exercises. And you find these things in literature as well. But to say that we came to conclusions such as, okay, we have this and this genre, in these genres, these techniques are the ones used, that would be simplifying matters. It's more complex.
Obviously, there are basic ways in which the fact that you don't have an external narrator in a drama to explicitly relate character information means that certain things don't apply in specific genres. But still, to a remarkable extent, and this mirrors something that Irene and her collaborators found earlier in earlier volumes in the series as well. There is a lot of consistency in how techniques start from Homer and get used all the way through, as it were.
The importance of specific devices or techniques is also often driven by a specific agenda of the author, or by the narratological layout of works. And in ego narrations, first person narrations, for example, it's much less likely to find extensive, omniscient depictions by a narrator, because in passages of external narration, narrators can give more detailed information about what their characters are thinking, or about how their characters are feeling. For ego narrators, and for first person narrators, that's much more difficult. So So there you can of course identify certain patterns in how these techniques are being used or not.
And on the point of genre, what I also found really exciting when we were doing the book is to see techniques that you wouldn't necessarily expect to show up in particular genres sometimes show up. So one example that has always stuck with me is this notion that as a narrator, you can be unsure what a character was feeling or of the motivations of a character. And you might expect that from, I don't know, historiography, where you're dealing with real people, and as the narrator, you can be not quite sure about why historical figure X did what they did. But then to see that same technique also end up in or being used in the novels, where a narrator can say, I don't know why the protagonists did that. That type of interesting tweak of what you might expect from a technique and its mapping onto genre was something that I found really interesting in going through sort of at our contributors' hands, going through this broad range of Greek literature.
And it seems like that comes full circle back to the conception of narrative and conceiving of narrative as more broadly than is often done, and then thinking about how characters and characterization reflects that in various genres. So you point out that a major advantage of a cognitive approach is that it allows us to track the dynamics of characterization, and one type of character that has become relevant in Jan's work and in my work, we both work on the Gospel of Mark, is what's called the offstage character. And so Jan is interested, for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, how the Holy Spirit seems to be this offstage character, but perhaps the presence of the Holy Spirit as a character is more pervasive than what we might often assume. Also, I've been interested in Satan as a character. In Mark's Gospel, we see Satan acting at the beginning, and Satan's mentioned a couple other times, but seems to be off scene or off stage. So here's my question. From your point of view, how does it work in ancient drama that a character is only introduced at the beginning of the prologue and then remains in the audience's mind? And maybe this relates to what you were talking before about the primacy effect. How does it work for this, I guess, character construction to take place with offstage characters?
Yeah, I guess in the case of drama, and you're probably referring to with the label offstage character to that one article by Irene de Jong again, who wrote about offstage characters. In the case of drama, offstage has a literal sense, right? In that the characters that she writes about in that article, we actually never see on stage except when they're dead. So she talks about the princess in Medea, and about Neoptolemus in Euripides' Andromache, and about Aegisthus in Euripides' Electra. And those are all characters that we never actually meet on stage. We only hear about them from other characters. And I think what that particularly draws attention to is that fact that what other characters say about, or what characters say about each other, comes with all kinds of problems of reliability, of can we trust what these characters are saying about, can we trust what Electra tells us about Aegisthus? If that then seems to conflict with what the messenger tells us about Aegisthus later on in the play, how do we as audience members make sense of those two potentially opposing things? So it sort of puts additional weight on something that I think is important anyway, but sort of brings it into clearer focus. The fact that for a lot of our character information, we rely on what other characters are thinking and saying and how they frame each other. And that in the case of those offstage characters, who, in those cases, we actually never meet, it just becomes a hugely important aspect of how we interpret characters anyway.
How you might see, you mentioned the primacy effect before, how you see that, or do you think that fits in with, especially characters that are mentioned at the beginning?
Yeah. In the case of tragedy, to which Evert was just referring, and an additional complexity is, of course, that there we do not even have a narrator in the first place. So in many other genres, we have a narrator who gives information, which in some cases might then be contradicted by characters in the novel, but at least you have the voice of a narrator. In tragedy, we don't even have that. We have just what the characters say, and then in the case of these offstage characters, it's only what characters say about them. So we have a kind of, it's even some sort of double distancing. Question about primacy reminds me of an interesting passage in one of the ancient Greek novels, where we have a character whose name is Callisthenes, who briefly pops up at the beginning of the story. His idea is to abduct the heroine, but he abducts the wrong girl, and after that we don't hear from that character anymore. It's a character being extremely negatively characterized by the primary narrator, so by the hero of the story, who afterwards tells his own story himself. So the very first characterization, extremely negative, comes on stage, figuratively speaking, then abducts a girl who is, in his view, the heroine, but who is not. And then we don't hear from that character throughout the entire novel, and at the very end comes back, and it seems that, he turns out to have undergone and some sort of metamorphosis. I think metabole is the term used in the Greek, and it turns out to have become this exemplary character. But of course, that information, when you think about it, was of course known by the primary narrator at the moment of the. So there we have a very clear case of an, well, almost offstage character. He's on stage twice in the entire novel, and in the two cases you get diametrically opposed characterization. So there, I think, paying attention to things like primacy, to questions like who characterizes and why, and what background does this narrator have? What are his motivations to characterize a character in a certain way, or to portray him in a certain light? There, I think such questions really can pay off for our understanding of what's going on in the narrative.
My last question then has to do with certain aspects of a cognitive approach that you think are advantageous. Your contributors take some and not others, and run with things like primacy and maybe some things like mind reading don't take up. I guess my question is, how does the relationship between what you do in the introduction and what you see played out in the contributions, how does this indicate how far the discipline of I guess narratology has come, and how far it has to go?
So the book dates from 2018. Of course, the planning of it all started much earlier. And at the very start, Evert and I sat down in Amsterdam, that was, to go through some of the intellectual premises that we wanted to be on the basis of the work. So that was even before contacting contributors, and that must have been 2011, 2012. Of course, that's 10 years ago now, and it's really amazing to see how in these 10 years how fast the field has been developing. Yeah, my overall impression is that there is a tendency in the field to perhaps further move away from the text and more towards the importance of how information is processed, whereas our book really quite explicitly tries to combine the two.
My sense is that some of the areas of cognitive science that have been most in focus recently in cognitive narratology, but in cognitive literary studies more broadly, as it pertains to character, are things like mind reading and the whole debate around that. How do we even understand other people's intentions and beliefs and dispositions? And from the 4E perspective that Koen mentioned, also this idea that we have a sort of an immediate perceptual understanding of each other from looking at each other's physical actions, a much more embodied understanding of other people, simply by engaging with our embodied surrounding and other people in it. And my sense is that when it comes to close reading of texts, those are hugely interesting aspects that we can look into and that call attention to particular moments like what we were talking about earlier of how other characters interpret each other, how people work with gaze, or how people react to actions. There are individual aspects of literary texts that those new approaches really call a lot of attention to in interesting ways. To my mind, some of the sort of the, if it's fair to say, older cognitive approaches, first generation cognitive approaches, the bottom-up, top-down model, for instance, in a way do a better job of allowing us to work through a text from beginning to end and building a character idea as an integrated whole. So in a sense, if the question is, do we need cognitive studies to do narratology well? What do we need to do? I think yes, absolutely, but we have to be, to my mind, sort of balanced in how we apply them, and certainly also don't miss sight of the kinds of themes and approaches that older literary theory was interested in, and our volume sort of sits in an early phase of all that, in a middle ground. As Koen said, we conceptualized it when some of these debates hadn't really broken onto the scene, or at least we weren't aware of them.
And it also very much depends on what sort of questions you ultimately want to answer in the book you're writing, of course, and for some of these, close reading will be indispensable. For others, it will not so be important, I imagine. Or so, yeah. So there, it's difficult to to speak about this in very general terms, in a sense, as well.
Well, do you have any final comments for those listening, those tuning in, about how your book might be beneficial to them, especially those who may have not thought about cognitive studies before?
First of all, Greek literature, but perhaps also broader than this, because many of these techniques we discuss in the book, they are of course not limited to Greek literature. So they were part of a rhetorical toolkit which was being passed on, and which is also which can also be seen at work in Latin literature, but also in later traditions. And in all of these traditions, I think the question then becomes, what does the use of these techniques mean, or how do they help readers to construct in their minds some sort of image of the character on the basis of specific pieces of information? Or I hope that we've given in the book some sort of as we said before, some sort of model that kind of marries different aspects of the theory, which in combination work well.